at it.
Check 1 2 1 2. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming this evening. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. We're just doing a mic check for the folks online. Those numbers with me.
Good morning, everyone. If we could find our seats, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Beckett, and I chair the Board of Trustees of Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. And on behalf of my colleagues on the board, we welcome you to the fifth and final forum on reimagining Minnesota State. I have declared that spring is here. There is no snow. And the Final Four is all in town. I hope that you have your tickets. And no, I cannot get you tickets. And I can't allow you in the suites either, so. But thank you. We began this forum in December and have created a tremendous platform for conversation about the future of Minnesota State and how we must respond through strategic innovation. I'm particularly excited about today's session, Innovative Models, Improving Quality, Increasing Access, and Reducing Costs Through System-Wide Innovation. During this morning's session, our panelists will discuss how higher education institutions are approaching collaborative innovation in support of important outcomes, such as increasing student success, improving quality, and reducing costs. We have a terrific panel today, and I'm excited to have both of them here today. Thank you for coming. First is Bridget Burns of the University Innovation Alliance and Louis Suarez of the American Council on Education, and are recognized thought leaders on the topic of innovation and bringing promising practices to scale across multiple institutions. I hope their presentations will spur our own thinking about how we might approach deliberate innovation across the Minnesota State system. But before we start the session, there's certainly some folks I'd like to thank. Again, I want to thank the forum members for being a part of this process. Thank you for your leadership, your thoughts on this, and sticking through us through this period of time. I can assure you that the discussions that we have been very spirited, as well as very innovative in the thoughts that are coming through. So I'm looking forward for the board and the chancellor to share the final report probably in June. And I also want to thank President Ginny Arthur. Ginny, would you stand up, please? I want to thank her and thank you and your staff for allowing us to come on campus. Isn't this a beautiful campus? It just, that nice shining light on the hill, it is beautiful. I also want to thank those attending today's session. We have nearly 150 people joining us in person at Metro State and online at locations across the system. For those in attendance, we have provided discussion questions for you to consider as we hear from our speakers. Please fill them out as a way to share your thoughts and suggestions regarding today's topics. For those of you attending online, the discussion questions are available on Reimagining Minnesota State website. We have posted a brief survey on the site as a way for you to submit your responses. This is going to be an excellent presentation today. And again, I want to state that I think we have a great panel. And of course, Dr. Terry McTaggart has been in this process with us, obviously a national thought leader. And Terry, thank you for guiding us through this process. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you.
It's just terrific to be here. About 40 years ago, I worked as a member of the staff at Metro State in what had been a grocery store with uneven floors and kind of some. I see some nods there. Some people, I think, in the room remember that experience. The College for Working Adults, upper division. It was the innovative, non-traditional wing of the institution, and here we are today in this splendid facility. We've got doctoral programs, master's program, four-year programs. What was revolutionary has become kind of orthodox in some ways, and I imagine as you migrated to this more comprehensive institution, there were probably some rough spots along the way. It's probably a safe prediction. but on a personal level, it's just wonderful to be here and actually to have met some people that I worked with in those prior years. My job this morning is very, very simple. I just want to reinforce the kind of schedule that we'll be working on. I want to introduce the speakers, and I want to encourage you to ask questions. So the schedule. In just a few minutes, we'll have our speakers begin. The first will be Bridget Burns, and I'll introduce her in a moment. They'll talk for about 30, 35 minutes, and then immediately go to Suarez from the American Council on Education for his perspective on innovation and what's happening across the country. Take a short break, and then it'll be time for Q&A. Either Inga Chapin or Lisa Foss, my colleague in all of this, will bring some questions forward to me. I've got one or two to sort of prime the pump initially if we need it, and we'll wind down about 9:45 or so in this group here. Continuing discussions at Metro State with prepared facilitators and around the state of Minnesota for those listening in or watching in at a distance. So the whole operation will probably wind down around noon or so, but this collective formal part will be over about 9:45 or 10. I'd like to call your attention to the briefing paper for this session. You know, it's appropriate that we're at Metro State for the culminating meeting on this, and that the topic is innovation, barriers to it, how to make it happen, et cetera, given the history of Metro State. The briefing paper written by Dr. Lisa Foss is just actually the best primer on the vocabulary and thinking of innovation that I've read. It's about 13 pages, and if you may be the most creative and innovative person in your department or in your unit, but if you haven't had a chance to get a sense for the kind of how the innovation community thinks and talks about this, it's well worth taking a look at. Couldn't recommend it. Couldn't recommend Lisa's work more. Introductions. Bridget was kind of created her own job, I think. Is that true? Yeah. She founded an innovation alliance that pulls together a number of universities that are trying to define the frontier, the cutting edge in this business. And she won't talk too much about individual schools or probably about the alliance itself, but rather about the principles involved in trying to lead change at famously change-averse institutions. And then I should mention, Bridget has been honored as one of the 16, I don't know what the 17th was, but one of the 16 most innovative leaders in higher education by Washington Monthly, which is a very reputable assessment of her work. So we look forward to her comments. She'll lead off. And then Suarez from the American Council on Ed, whose title says it all, excuse me, Chief Learning and Innovation Officer, and author of another seminal piece of work that if you want to read one thing about innovation in this business, particularly as it relates to adult learners, I'd recommend The Post-Traditional Learners. Luis may not have coined that phrase, but it certainly has become very current since his publication. Post-Traditional Learners in the Transformation of Higher Education. And safe to say that that'll be his topic. I think that's about it for that stage of the game. Bridget, would you come on up, please?
All right, well, good morning. Thank you so much.
Let's hear it for Bridget!
Really good morning, because my body is on West Coast time, so yes. I don't know how I drew the short straw since Lewis is on East Coast time, but we'll fight about it later. My name, as he said, is Bridget Burns, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of the things that we're learning around innovation around the country, how we help institutions work together to try and improve outcomes, especially for the students that we all need to be thinking about. Because the broad overview is that higher education, especially in the United States, is failing students across the board. And that's something that we're all concerned about, and it's going to require us to actually work together to try and address it. You see, I'm a very unlikely person to be up here on this stage or to be considered an expert in higher ed. I wasn't actually supposed to even make it to college. I grew up in poverty in rural Montana, and just like millions of other American students, I had generally terrible information about college given to me, and I followed it blindly. The only time that we ever talked about college in my home would be when my dad would joke that if I wanted to go to college, that I should do what my brother did and win a state championship in wrestling, which was incredibly unhelpful for a 13-year-old girl. So, but I actually, just like many of our students, I actually followed that advice. I thought, okay, so if I excel in some forum like that, then I'll get to go to college. And so I completely neglected my studies. And when I finally graduated high school, I had a 2.3 GPA, which was just barely over the line, but I was an undefeated state champion in debate. And it turns out that people were not nearly as interested in underperforming academic students who were pretty good at arguing as they were in Big Ten wrestlers. So therefore, I had to find a different way. And so I stumbled to a community college in northern Idaho. And again, like millions of our students, I had some very basic assumptions about higher education that we need to at least acknowledge if we're going to talk about innovation. And that was that I, as 18-year-old me, really thought that I'd been taught to respect my elders and listen to them. And so naturally, when I look at these universities that have people with fancy titles, PhDs, and they run a college, right? So of course I should follow the very few pieces of information I am signaled with. I follow the signals. Think about the signals that you send or you don't send at your institution. Because I didn't get a lot, but I just followed them. So one, when they told me as a low-income student that I should take out thousands of dollars in student loans, more than I'd ever seen in my life, well then I assume naturally I should do that, right? That it would work out and that people would be watching and they would help guide me and make sure that I made the right choices along the way. Because as a young person, I was just kind of following along what I saw. And unfortunately, I took very interesting classes that had nothing to do with my program of study, and no academic advisor ever reached out to me. The institution never signaled that I was on the wrong course. Instead, what they did is what we all do, which is they gave me a choose-your-own-adventure map and wished me the best. Limited information about career outcomes, limited information about best insights, especially for students from my background. And so when I finally graduated from college with a bachelor's degree, it was 7 years later, 7. And I had 50 extra credits that I didn't need and $50,000 in student loans. Now, unfortunately, my story is true for far too many students, and mine works out, but for a lot of them it doesn't. And so what we need to talk about today is that there are some fundamental core assumptions to higher education in America and how we are designed that need to be acknowledged. And the first of which is that I was stumbling upon a dirty secret that needs to be talked about. And that is that higher education was never actually designed around students. This gets me in trouble some places because people are uncomfortable with that reality. But the truth is, if you look at the history of higher education, it's true. It was originally designed around the faculty and later the administration. And do you know who is most uncomfortable with that? The faculty and the administration. Because they alone, especially the faculty, they have a front row seat to watch high potential students walk out their doors every day, never to return, for an entirely predictable reason that has happened to thousands of students before. And they are frustrated that we cannot seem to get this right. So higher education, when folks resist this, I'll give you an example that probably makes it real. At every university I've ever been to, despite their urging that no, it really was designed around students, we're allegedly about helping them graduate, right? And you can check this with your campuses. And yet, at every campus I've ever been to, when it comes to graduation, if a student is ready to graduate, the institution doesn't know. In fact, the student has to tell the campus that they're ready to graduate. And then they have to fill out a bunch of forms. And then they usually have to pay a fee. Now, if that's not bad design, if that's really what we're about, I don't know what is. Think about that in terms of a customer service experience in anything you do in the private sector, right? We would expect something more. And students in this generation, they expect something more. They expect that we are wise, that we have benefited from the millions of interactions with students from the past, that we have synthesized that information, and that, of course, our processes should naturally consider them. Like design thinking and all of that stuff these days, we expect more. So higher education in America was not designed around students, but just know this doesn't mean that this was like, there's nobody twisting their mustache in an ivory tower. This is accidental. The nice thing about design problems is that it means that you can take away motivation and you can remove questions about people's intentions. It's just a design problem, which means we can design our way out of this. But you have to first know that this is not something that's special to Minnesota. It's not something that's special to any particular state. It's broadly about higher education, especially in the United States, because of something called isomorphism. Many of you are probably familiar with this concept. It's not unique to higher education. Essentially, we mimic what we see elsewhere as a signal for what is good, right? So if I look at a business, okay, these are the kinds of departments that I should need. All right, so I'm going to build something that this is what a hospital should look like. Okay, I'm going to do that. Okay. And in universities, we did the exact same thing. When higher education was first created in the United States, it was for the preservation of democracy. We were a baby democracy. We were afraid of being overtaken by the British again. And so we thought, well, let's invest in the intellectual capital of our citizens. Let's make sure we have all ideas coming up. Let's make sure that we won't be overtaken again, right? And so we looked to signals for what higher education should look like, what was good. And unfortunately, we replicated that. And while that has worked for a while, what we need to talk about is that the underlying value system for some of those more elite models that we originally were mimicking continues to this day, and it's no longer serving students in Minnesota, and it's not serving students in the United States. So there's some basic, those value system and that assumption are kind of basically four things. First, it was designed around the few, not the many. It was not designed to meet the needs of the scale of students that we need to serve. And especially it was designed around this 18 to 22-year-old super cute boutique idea that that's who we need to educate, not thinking about who we need to educate today. Second, it has this really misguided belief that rare is good and that rare is a good signal for quality. In fact, to this day, that's really what we use. If it's hard to get in somewhere, that means it must be good. But we learned a few weeks ago that that is actually not necessarily a credible reason, right? That's not a credible indicator. But that's also kind of like saying, I know I have a good doctor because I've never gotten in to see them because it's a really long line, right? It's actually quite difficult to measure quality, and that's fair, but I don't think we should just resort to the lazy idea that rare is the best indicator. But the more fundamental issue that we need to talk about is that there is this belief in the value system in these, how our institutions are formed, that when a student drops out, it's on them. It's their fault. In fact, it's probably an indication that what you're probably doing something that's really hard and fancy. It's a sign, look to your left, look to your right, right? And under that we want to really focus on is that there is this belief that if a low income, a first generation, or a student of color, if they drop out, that, well, it's just something unique about them and their characteristics, and we should bolt on a boutique center or program or initiative for that type of student. But that is misguided. The truth is, they're just a student. They should be your leading indicator. They are the types of students who have just additional stress in their life. They're working 3 jobs, they're dealing with institutionalized racism, they're dealing with the fact that they have terrible advice that they're following or no advice whatsoever. So we should design our systems and our institutions around, we should lean in when we lose one of those students and get curious because they are showing us the flaws in the system that need to be re-engineered around the experience of the individual. Does that make sense? So this is something that's important in that isomorphism, most universities, as obsessed as we are with telling you how special and different we are, which is super cute, we're generally doing basically the same thing. The difference and the variable is modality, its location, its size, and quality, all these things, but generally speaking, classrooms around the country look exactly the same, roughly, as they did from the beginning of higher education. We're doing relatively similar things, and we replicate what we see, which is good because if you see innovation, we can replicate that, right? Isomorphism might be the problem, it's also going to be part of the solution. So this has led to a problematic issue that we need to talk about in the United States, and we're seeing it play out, how that value system is not serving us. And that is shown in the data. First, we are facing a shortfall of college degrees of about 11 million. We are simply not producing quality credentials at the rate that we need to step up for economic demand. We offer degrees in things they don't want anymore. People expect degrees for things they didn't used to. And also, spoiler, we fail half of all the people who walk in the door. That last one's probably something we want to deal with. The other issue that adds tension here is that for the first time in US history, low-income students are the majority in public K-12. So that means the students like me are going to be coming in mass, and if we are not thinking about the future of their needs, if we're not re-engineering and innovating to address the challenges that we could based on what we're seeing today, then we are going to be in trouble. The last is that these are the students who are coming, and this is how poorly we've served them in the past. I am from that demographic at the bottom quartile. When Tim Rennick came, he probably shared this same slide with you. If you're born into a low-income family, that bottom red line, like myself, out of every 100, about 6.2 were getting a bachelor's degree in the 1970s. And after all of our hype about progress and innovation, it's only now 8.3%. Okay, so we've made relatively no progress with low-income communities when it comes to bachelor's degree attainment, which I realize is not the only indicator, but it's at least a healthy one for us to think about how we're serving. The thing that really is I guess hopeful or red flag, high-income populations, that top one, used to be getting a 40% clip. We've doubled their attainment, yay, but all that means is we've doubled the achievement gap. Turns out that's something we're really good at. So this is a challenge that is not just a Minnesota challenge, it's every state in the United States, and it's going to require that we help institutions work together to try and solve it. No one campus will be able to address this, no one type of campus, right? The broad picture is that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it does. Higher education in America was perfectly designed to get these kinds of results, to underperform for these types of students. So that is the sad part of my presentation. I promise I will get to the hope and change. Things are actually pretty optimistic in my view. And it's because, I'm not just saying this with speculation, it's because I've spent the last 5 years working with campuses around the country who have actually been trying to address this in their front yard. And we have learned some things that we think are helpful, and we hope that they are inspiring to you in terms of how you set the table for institutions to rise to this challenge and how you set the conditions for them to solve it together. So these are my campuses, and they are large public research intensives, but please do not focus on that because it's kind of not that relevant. The only thing that matters is that they actually have something in common with each other. Any type of institution could be doing this kind of work. The key is they need some things in common, some kind of shared understanding of the world. And so that's something that these campuses have. The other piece that you need to know is that they didn't actually know each other before we started, and they have no reason to trust each other. One boutique parts of large public research intensives that really prompted some of this is that these campuses are some of the most competitive. They have no reason to get along. They don't just have the research challenge, and they also have sports and state appropriation and fighting for students and all of these things. So it was mainly that they could be able to overcome those boundaries and they could find things in common with each other. And so these campuses, I didn't actually create this, just to be clear. This is something that a group of presidents and chancellors got in a room together, and they started talking about these issues. And the conversation was something like this. Hey, what are you up to? What are you doing on your campus to address this problem? I think I'm doing something similar, but I'm not entirely sure, because it's actually really hard to look into your campus and know what you're doing and whether it's good enough or it's the best, and to compare it with other programs elsewhere. And then they started talking about scale. And gosh, that sounds like you've really made some progress there. Why aren't we scaling these things up? It's super adorable that we're just tinkering in silos as a sector, reinventing the wheel, but like, gosh, 11 heads, maybe better than one. And so these campus presidents and chancellors formed the University Innovation Alliance, and it was essentially that they wanted to unite around a sense of urgency, that we were doing a terrible job addressing the challenge facing our country, and going it alone is a massive waste of time, energy, and money. And students are the ones who are paying that price. So these campuses agreed to 4 basic things when they formed. They were going to produce more degrees. Specifically, they were going to set really ambitious attainment targets. Second, they were going to produce specifically more low-income degrees. They thought that if we could address the socioeconomic challenge, that would be really worth our time. They were going to, third, innovate together and actually transparently share their data. They were going to try and hold each other accountable. And lastly, they were going to actively hold down their costs. So those were the 4 commitments of the Alliance. And then I came in as an ACE Fellow, free labor, to try and actually help them make that into a reality. And over the past, it's now been 5 years. I just came from Purdue yesterday, where we were holding our 9th convening of our campuses. And we've been able to, like I said, we've been able to do some really interesting work. And it's not special to us. Honestly, any of you could be doing this. Any of your campuses could be doing this work. It is really based on this radical premise that we are all struggling with the same problem. And that if you get nothing else from my presentation today, you should know that is true. It does not matter where you are, what kind of institution you're in. There will be slightly different colors and flavors, but every financial aid director I've ever talked to, generally same problems. Institutional research, generally same problems. Undergraduate, same problems, right? And so what if we could actually stop being obsessed with the boundaries of our institutions and actually have conversations, build trust with each other, pitch and catch ideas, and try and solve some of these more global challenges. So the Alliance, when I said we first rolled out, we set some goals that were pretty ambitious. This was our first goal. It was something that was for the White House College Opportunity Summit, and it was pretty terrifying for me because President Obama announced it on stage, which sounds nice, but the back end of that is that the White House had actually not believed us when we set this goal. They made us prove in the data that it was possible, which is good on them. This was beyond all current and stretch capacity. We were going to graduate an additional 68,000 students. And since that time, we're now on track to produce 94,000 in that same time period. So it turns out we weren't actually ambitious enough, and that we completely underestimated the possibility of what was going to happen. And that's nice, but the most important piece is that we have increased our low-income degrees by 29%. So we are producing, in the past 5 years, that's 27,000 additional low-income graduates have come from these institutions. And we know that this is something that we didn't have unusual demographics in our favor for our states for these things. And I would also say this is not like the UIA cause to this, because I'm aware that we've only existed for 5 years. I think this reflects the serious level of commitment from the presidential and chancellor level, and that if you really set your teams up for success to have the best ideas and you are clear that this is actually the priority, not the million other priorities that you communicate in that same email, that you can actually be able to make some change. So these are some of the ways that we've worked together. I want to just give you a sense of, I know that we are talking about innovation, and so these are some of the specific innovations that we have worked together to scale up. Every year, we have scaled a massive intervention that has passed the sniff test at one campus, and then they are willing to vouch to their buddies on the other UIA campuses, and they talk about the shared problems. So it's actually a much better way to vet ideas, and I would encourage you to think about that here, because what I see wherever I go is that it is a lot of uncertainty, and there's a degree of fear about what is the right intervention for my campus today, what is the best practice, which vendor, what would be actually a waste of my time. This whole process of trying to figure out what the next step is a worthy endeavor for us to focus on, because it is very fuzzy, and you have a lot of noise in this space. You have vendors who are pitching, you have campuses who have exceptional data, but actually you don't know that they really changed their entrance requirements. It's very difficult to know what's real and substantive. So what I do with my time is I work on building their relationships and helping them have convenings that lead them to build trust and actually be vulnerable and share about failure and invest in those relationships. And if I focus on that, that trust is the lubricant for this work, because you're not going to vouch for something that isn't real. You're going to tell people the real story about why not to work with that vendor or what you wish you'd known before you started. Those are the kinds of conversations that support innovation, right? So The other piece about these specific interventions, which I can talk about later, there's not one, right? There's no silver bullet here. The progression is important because you can't have done chatbots if you haven't kind of cycled through some of these other, you can't do completion grants if you don't have predictive analytics and you haven't fixed your data. You definitely can't do proactive advising. I think we were very naive in thinking one scale project a year, but the truth is we're now simultaneously doing like 5 things because starting a project just means you start a project. And so it has not been black and white. It has not been a slam dunk. I want to be up here with my football and spike it in the end zone and tell you it's like so easy to innovate. But it's actually very complicated. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the underlying issues to focus on if you want to cultivate this kind of focus on scale. In terms of, from the broader system perspective, I think there are some things that you can do to really encourage people focusing on scale and focusing on sharing ideas that are actually going to help each other. The last piece I would share about this is these were all chosen by the campuses. Projects that come down from on high and are forced upon institutions do not work. If you set the table for institutions to actually talk about the big challenges facing Minnesota and to learn about what really is working out there in the field, they will be able to identify the projects and the interventions and the supports that they think actually will work and they want to move forward on. And you're going to be way more successful. I didn't come up with any one of these. I mean, the fellows program I actively stole from elsewhere, but and introduced that to the campuses. That was from ASU. And that's one thing I would point out is, I can talk to you about where innovative campuses are and what you can learn from them. At ASU, the reason, Michael Crow is super innovative, and, if you've had a chance to hear from him, you see why. But one of the pieces that people miss is that he has designed his office to allow for him to take action on good ideas. He has an office called University Initiatives that is full of fellows who their job is to just take whatever wild and crazy idea Mike has, prototype it, and actually build it up so that it has a fighting chance out in the institution. Lots of college presidents have good ideas. They rarely have a lane to put it in. So think about the design choices that university leaders make, because often presidents have to say, is this a government relations? Is this public affairs? Is this the provost? No good innovative idea really has a clear lane. So some of the lessons to share with you is that collaboration definitely helps us move faster. So this is a very obvious one. But in terms of the system level, if you're thinking about how you cultivate collaborative innovation, think about designing your convenings to actually ensure that people can build trust. That often means that the boss is not in the room. And by the way, my convenings are not built for presidents and chancellors. They have jobs to do. They are not the people who need to be brought together. It's the folks who are actually doing the work. It's usually VPs for undergraduate. It's folks who it's heads of advising and financial aid. It's the ones who are doing the work that I wished that my campus that I went to had done, of reimagining the experience of students and understanding what's going on in real time. So too often we are focused on the leadership level. You need the leadership to say this is important and to demonstrate leadership by doing that, but it's really about the time that we spend together should be about helping people build relationships and share about ideas and give each other insights. It should not be about being told what to do. The second thing is pay attention to incentives and rewards. So in higher ed, most of the incentives are individual. You get the degree, your institution moves up in the rankings, you get the research award, you get the attention. Publicity rarely goes to everybody, right? So think about creating incentives for multiple institutions to come together with a project. If you're at the system level and it's easy to get a grant for one institution, that's part of the problem. Of course there are going to be elbows out. I used to be a chief of staff for a university system, and I was part of the problem because I was always, throwing a ball on the floor and saying, run for it, and then I was surprised that they would throw elbows in the legislature, right? So be thinking about what the incentives are and how you can design them to help people actually want to work together. So something like, if you come up with a student success scale project that you want to do that involves 3 or more institutions, there is a natural funding line for that. Or there is a easy path, a glide path for that. Those rarely exist. Often collaborative grant making and projects like this are very hard. So I would focus in on unpacking what the obstacles are. You know, for me, every time I do anything new, I got to sign 11 MOUs. You got to update my 11 data sharing agreements. I got to figure out how to get another contract in place to give money to 11 different institutions. It's so messy and complicated. So if you want something, if you really want collaborative innovation, don't focus on telling people to do that work. Set the table for them to come to that conclusion, bring them together, but then unpack those specific barriers and obstacles that exist in your state that rarely are focused upon. So I think those are some of the ideas that I would suggest. Think about the disincentives, think about what people are encouraged to do. Lastly, in the UIA, you get on stage for scaling an idea and attributing where you got the idea. I'm not interested in shiny ponies. I'm not interested in campuses who invent the wheel again or tell me about their special new initiative or this new program that they're doing. Generally speaking, I find that there is not as much innovation as people think in terms of boutique ideas. The best innovations usually involve multiple players, and taking an idea that someone did and riffing on it and evolving it and adapting it, that's innovation, right? And figuring out how, and then sharing back. So set the stage so that people are elevated when they talk about who inspires them or where they got the idea. If you don't do that, then people will steal ideas or they will hide the ball. And those are things that are not helpful. Some other things that we need to talk about in terms of cultivating this kind of innovation and this kind of collaborative work is that this is what the modern higher ed professor or administrator's life looks like. Yeah, it's a problem. So we have a capacity problem in that we have this belief that if we just give you more work, that your plate will expand. And we do this all the time. We do it to faculty, we do it to administrators. It turns out the real support we need in terms of capacity is project managers who can actually report up to the folks who are overburdened. When I come to a campus, I look for the people who are effective. You know how you find them? They have more work than everyone else and they can barely get by. You know what the reward is for doing good work? More work. Isn't that cute? We don't actually give them supports or any of the scaffolding necessary to be successful. So the other piece about capacity we need to acknowledge is that at least in the states that I work, and especially when I was at the university system, we have this thing where instead of acknowledging when we have a new project that it might be worth hiring a person, we hire back a retired person at 0.49. And that's an inexpensive way for us to have skilled expertise come in and serve on a temporary basis. But the damaging effect over time is serious because our org charts are completely unrealistic. They don't honestly say what we're working on because we have all these part-timers and these people who are borrowed or consultants. And therefore, yeah, a lot of it doesn't make sense. So I would just suggest thinking about actually investing and acknowledging where you have real work to be done and not just like beg, borrowing, and stealing, but actually investing in that. And again, project management, change management support that reports up to these people who are passionate and smart and doing the work, things that make their lives easier, like that is a great investment. The second is that even if you get through all your time, if when people do get through their workload and they can maybe get through at the end of the day, when they are looking for a new idea, this is what it's like to talk to higher education and ask what ideas they should pursue. Most institutions are obsessed with talking about themselves and promoting, and we set the conditions for that because it's a scarcity-fueled environment and people are always trying to get more students, more resources, more publicity, more attention, like more, because it's never enough, right? And so that can be somewhat damaging because it's difficult to navigate through that. It's a lot of noise. So just acknowledge this and think about the ways that you set the table and invite people. When do you invite people to testify in this state? When do you get people publicity? When do you acknowledge things? Is it because someone invented something new? Or it's because they're talking about themselves? Maybe consider when someone is inspired by another campus and they talk about that, that's worthy of elevating, right? Or when someone does something selfless. You all saw Tim Rennick come here and speak. He's an incredibly generous person. I think he's one of the most generous in higher ed. We should elevate that kind of behavior. People who are selfless and out on the road doing the shuttle diplomacy of sharing ideas. There's not a lot of rewards for showing up in random airports and giving speeches, but it's essentially how the diffusion of innovation is happening in higher ed, and it's really disproportionately falling on the shoulders of a few. This is part of the solution. As I wrap, I want to share with you, we have some ideas of how to do this work. These are our fellows. Like I told you about that fellows program that we stole / adapted / scaled from ASU. We, at our campuses, we invest in giving them an opportunity to hire a fellow. These are them. Most of them are former first-gen, low-income students of color. We see them as potentially the future college presidents of the United States. And we are investing in helping them learn change management and shepherding innovation, the two things that we think higher ed really needs. $50,000 to $70,000 a person. They're less expensive than a retired person, doing it a 0.49 in most cases for these projects. They are ad hoc, and most importantly, they offload the overburdened plates of senior administrators. So they would come in for, say, Tim or any of these other people. If you have faculty who are advancing new work, a fellow would come in and actually be able to lighten their load so they could actually work on innovation. Innovation does not happen when you are racing 15-minute to 15-minute meetings and you can barely get through your inbox at the end of the day. You will not have a good idea that strikes you like lightning. Lastly, some things that you can do today. So this is an example of some of the innovation work that we've done that is super basic and not expensive, and that's the key. So process mapping is something that is not based in higher ed, but we do it all the time in the business sector. When people are trying to figure out what to do first, this is something we suggest. It doesn't cost anything other than, I think we're keeping Post-it notes in business. And what happens is when you process map, you are trying to actually see the system, how it is affecting and serving students. You cannot bring a new innovation into a corrupt system that is not, you're not self-aware of what's actually going on. It won't be effective. So the first thing to do is actually lay it out and see how it's really presenting for students' experiences. So this is a process map that happened at Michigan State. Process mapping is you put a sticky note up for every step in the process or every communication. They decided they wanted to map out the amount of communication coming from the institution from the time the student gets admitted to the day they show up on campus. And they found that for that 3-month window of time, they were sending 450 emails. And I guarantee you that is happening on every one of your campuses. It's happening on every one of mine. We are really bad at this piece. And for low-income first-generation students, it is really damaging. And so they also found that there were 50 types of hold a student could have on their account that the campus didn't know about. There are, it helps you not romanticize the system. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And the nice thing about process mapping is you get a group of people together and you have someone who's facilitating it. Our fellows are all trained. We teach trainings in this method. And ultimately, everyone sees the idea together. They see the low-hanging fruit. And you instantly have momentum because you identify some things you could fix. And you stop romanticizing. You see the system as it really is, not how you fantasize it to be. So this is just one example of an idea that got stolen. It was inspired by Georgia State, inspired it. This is at Michigan State, and now our campuses do it at every juncture of the student experience. If you want to innovate, you have to know what you're dealing with first. Lastly, I think you should look to other sectors, not just higher education if you want to be inspired. I look to places all over to see good ideas about how to cultivate community. And one of those is Weight Watchers. So at Weight Watchers, everyone struggles with weight loss. It's very difficult. Very simple premise. You have to decide to sign yourself up for Weight Watchers. No one else can sign you up. Everyone agrees to transparent data sharing. They weigh in on the same scale. When you make progress, they elevate and praise you. They don't shame you. There's plenty of shame to go around in higher ed. If it was an effective vehicle, it would have worked. It's not. So you elevate people who are making good progress, and then most importantly, people walk into a room at Weight Watchers and they are giving each other tips and tricks and insights about what's helping them. And that's how you build a community of practice. So you can look to inspiration all throughout higher ed, and I hope that we've been inspiring to you, but you should also look to other places because the hotbed of innovation is not necessarily higher ed when it comes to institutional transformation. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and just know that we stand by as champions of student success, that we are here to cheer you on and to help wherever possible, and just know that this work doesn't have to be expensive, it doesn't have to be super fancy. What matters is focus on the design and focus on helping the people who are already doing this work, because the big picture is no one works in higher education because of the money. They work in higher ed because someone changed their life. I've never met a faculty member who works for any other reason. And so know that they want to be an ally in this work, and all we have to do is get out of their way. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Luis, that was just terrific, wasn't it? Yeah. No, that was perfect timing given coming to the end of this stage of the process of talking about how to put it into action. My friend.
How's everyone doing out there? How about the folks in the back? All right. You know, when I first walked in, I was going to suggest that folks move to the front, but sitting up right here waiting, Bridget, that was awesome. You really get that feeling of being in a movie cinema in the front row, and you're craned up at this massive screen the whole time. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Suarez. I'm the Chief Learning and Innovation Officer at ACE. I think more important, by way of a little bit more about me, I'm a policy researcher by training. So I started at the state level in Rhode Island, where I'm from, largely doing public policy for the governor there. And then I moved to the think tank world in DC, and now I work at ACE, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. I primarily focus on two areas of higher education: adult learners. That's mostly because my parents are both immigrants from Portugal. My dad has a 7th grade education, and my mom has a 6th grade education. And the only thing my dad ever told me about school was, Louis, school is your work, do your work. And I just followed my nose the rest of the way. And to the extent I've been successful in some way, it's because my dad would tell me that. And that's reflected in much of the writing that I do. Technology is something else I write about in higher education and its implementation. That came along much later. After I had come to DC, I was working in a think tank called the Center for American Progress. And I went to a meeting. One of my first meetings was with Governor Warner from Virginia. And he has this raspy voice. And we were having this conversation, myself and my boss, Sarah Wartell, with him and his staff. And he said, Louis, all you're talking about is how we pay more for this. How do you make it cheaper? How do you keep it good but make it cheaper? And it led me on this really circuitous path to a paper that I wrote with Dr. Clay Christensen from Harvard University called Disrupting College. And ever since then, I've become really entranced about the effective use of technology in higher education. And so those are the two areas that you'll see reflected in presentations that I do. This particular one, it's funny when that was 8 years ago or 9 that I wrote that paper. And I did a lot of predicting then. I don't do predicting anymore. I more talk about what are tools that higher education leaders can use, ways of seeing the system that they're in, the institution that they're in, to intentionally lead it or manage it. And you'll see that reflected in the presentation that I do today. I'll do a little bit about ACE just to remind folks some of the pressures on higher ed, which I think I might go through those fairly quickly because I think Bridget did that very well. A way of thinking about innovation, and then some meta themes. I think that, if you go back to the land-grant colleges in 1862, when society changes, colleges change. And change like that is never easy, nor does it happen instantaneously. It happens over time. And I think we're at another moment like that, one that I've called the learning economy, and others have called the learning economy in my work, in their work. And that has really interesting implications for how you view learning and the different places that it comes from. And then just to open for discussion. So, I use these, I don't know, is the pointer working on this? Merlin, does the pointer work on this? I think it's really cool that the IT guy's name is Merlin. Not really. Oh, thanks you, Merlin. These are, if you go to Amazon, Google Future of Higher Ed, and these are some of the books that come up in the top 20. And they have very different flavors to them. The End of College and College Unbound tend to be the technology triumphant versions. It's everything that can be digitized will be digitized, and colleges will close by the thousands in the next couple of decades. And also college disrupted fits in that category. American Higher Education in Crisis. This is by Goldie Blumenstick, who's a journalist at the Chronicle of Education. She focused really, it was an interesting lens on the the traditional equity closing equity gaps in higher education, which we haven't done such a great job on. But it didn't take the technology issue on specifically, but it looked at historic mission and how well we're doing there and how the technology talk could help to execute against that mission. This one I was surprised sometimes to find, using evidence of student learning to improve higher education. Too often in our public dialogue about higher education, we don't actually talk about things like, how do we know if students are learning things? How do we do that? Assessment is very challenging, both as an art and a science. And I think we need more substantive work like that. And Democracy's Education was Harry Boyd is a storied leader of liberal arts in higher education, and this was an initiative that grew out of AAC&U about 5 years ago. And what I like the most about this book was it acknowledged higher ed's challenges, but looked at it from a perspective of leadership for the future. It's how do we accept these challenges and be who we are and keep moving into the future. These are all alive. If you read, I was looking through the Star Tribune archives, and at some point or other in the last 2 years, you'll see themes when higher ed's addressed, or the economy's addressed, or the labor market's addressed. You'll see these themes about what higher education's role is. Is it quality? Is it too expensive? Is it not expensive enough, believe it or not? And how do higher ed leaders, how do the folks in this room, the folks that Bridget works with every day, how do you lead that conversation and not feel set upon by that conversation? This is an article from 2017, but there have been repeats in Inside Higher Ed about losing public higher ed's losing trust in American higher education, particularly on the Republican side, but not only. So I share this only for the purposes of, as you're leading, doing the difficult challenge of doing the work, this is the public narrative. And what's the aspect of leadership that occurs from within institutions and systems to the broader stakeholder groups? ACE is a membership institution. Just want to remind folks, because I use this slide largely. You'll see that we have about 1,700 members. About 27.6 of those are four-year public institutions. 36% are four-year privates. 13.1% two-year publics, and then a variety of other folks. The reason I use this slide is because, which I'll go to, I think my next slide is MinnState. Higher ed is very diverse. And I think that diversity is often a challenge and a strength at the same time. Data, I have a slide on Bridget's initiative later in my deck. So data doesn't so much take away diversity, but it helps us understand it and actually direct the way we use resources across that diversity. And I have, in reading the framing papers that you all have done from your summits and the proceedings, I see that you've been thinking a lot about, I think you call it systemsness in your dialogue as a group. And I think that there is something of an answer, as you'll see by the end of my slide, to the challenges of higher ed in how you balance being a system with diversity and how do you leverage strengths across that. The interesting thing here is, it's most often MinnState is described for a casual observer is 7 and 30. Those two numbers come up all the time. It comes up in the Star Tribune, it comes up in your own materials. What's interesting about that is how much diversity does that actually hide, right? Even in the 7, right? Missional diversity, value proposition diversity, forget about the 30. Like how much diversity lies in across the spectrum of what those folks do and how they do it. Here's the challenge. So about 54.8% of working age Minnesotans have some type of post-secondary certificate, associate degree, bachelor's degree. Those folks need continuing education. And then you have the remainder percentage don't have any kind of post-secondary certificate yet, something you all know well. I'll skip this. This is ACE's mission stuff. This is a little bit more about me. I think that higher education business models matter a lot. I think that one of the greatest challenges and one of the greatest movements that's actually taking place in higher ed right now is aligning program level data with financial data. It's both an emergent trend and it will transform institutions over time. We have not had the greatest ability at the level of outcome to measure ROI of dollars going into the system to dollars coming out of the system, any system. The pressures on higher ed. This is my favorite slide in the whole deck. This is the 787 Dreamliner. It is the world economy in a snapshot. It is built in 5 states, 9 countries, using 6 languages, 14 suppliers, global value chain, standards-based production. It's technology-driven. It has cross-disciplinary teams, and learning is built into the work. The faculty that study workplaces estimate that when they initially built the Dreamliner, an associate's degree worth of learning came out of the production process. This will matter a lot in a slide that comes later about how much learning is happening outside of formally structured environments in the economy and what that means for higher ed. The demand for higher education is strong. The job growth, this is drawing from the same data sets that Bridget used. Since the recession, the folks with the bachelor's degrees have gotten the most jobs. Those are the jobs that are becoming available. Folks with high school or less have actually been losing jobs in terms of openings. But yet there are a lot of pressures. So this is the price index. Tuition and fees is the light purple line at the top. Healthcare is the green line. Since 1980, you can see the challenge. This doesn't capture, of course, all of the nuanced realities of higher education. It doesn't capture student aid indices, but it's an important factor for 2 reasons. One, this is the slide that's most often seen in any national daily newspapers to show that the college is becoming increasingly affordable. And it also forces a question. When we begin to think about innovation, well, in my own writing, when I talk to our member campuses, one of the hardest things is to link innovation to financial results. It's sustainable institutional finance. Students are footing more of the bill, so it's getting more expensive, and because of state disinvestment, relatively, students are footing more of the bill. Tuition and fees are on the rise. This is from the College Board. Private, nonprofit 4-year is the highest increase, public 4-year, and public 2-year. The interesting thing about these two on the public side is that, one of the things we've lost I call it the fallacy of big numbers, like $1 trillion in student debt. Most of the folks that go to these schools average at about, especially public 4 years, about $27,000 in debt. ACE has been doing polling for the last year in focus groups and surveys around the country. And when you ask people, these are working class and middle class families, when you ask them what they think the average student debt is, even after you ask them, they say $87,000. Even when you show them the data, they don't believe you. And so they ask you where the numbers came from. And it's an important conceptual conversation, an important conversation when the innovation that's trying to solve the problems within the institutions in the systems also has to have this ongoing dialogue with families, public policymakers, and understanding how to balance that. That one I'll skip. Change of student demographics. So this is from a phenomenal book by Nathan Graw at Carleton College on changing demographics. And his argument is that based on changing demographics of the US population, only a handful of states, those colored in blue, are actually facing favorable trends in demographics, where the population growth is naturally going to increase enrollment in higher education. Minnesota is orange, which estimates a declining enrollment over the next, I think the time horizon here was to 2029, between 7.5% and 15% decrease in available students. And what do today's students look like? This is my post-traditional learner slide, Terry. 37% are ages 25 or over, 49% are financially independent. This is a really important indicator because, especially from the federal level, federal financial aid policy is designed around financially dependent students. So folks that are dependent on their parents to pay the bill. It's not really designed around the idea that almost half of all enrolled undergraduates are financially independent folks. 36% of independent students are living at or below the poverty line. Dependent students, 17%. This is fairly stable over time, but the independent number has been going up. It's reflective of Bridget's number of low-income students being on the rise as folks coming into college. 22% have dependent children. This is actually a little bit lower as the economy has picked up. This is from the most recent NIPSAS data. It's a federal survey that folks do. It had been hovering around 29%. The economy picked up a little bit, and so folks that are the indicator, most folks, including myself, think that it's that folks went back to work that have kids. But it's been hovering around a quarter of all students. 24% are first generation. Only 44% are enrolled exclusively full-time. This number raises all kinds of issues around, it's innovation, but it's like practical innovation. Like, if this is true, what does the built infrastructure of colleges need to look like? How many dorms do you need? How many classrooms do you need? If this is the trend line over time. 42% are enrolled at two-year colleges. 61% working while enrolled. This number has implications, I'll go into a little bit more, for how folks identify. I call it their learning identity. And only 14% are living on campus. You see the emergence of a post-traditional learner. I don't know that I created it. I was there at the beginning, though, Terry. And one of the where it came from was there were all these terms that we use to talk about students: at risk, non-traditional. They become part of the public dialogue because they're embedded in the policy conversation. They structure the way money flows, the way administrators look at how to serve students, where innovation can happen in the continuing ed shop of an institution. But they're needed wage earners. One of the biggest arguments in the post-traditional learner adult community is, what's the right age cutoff? And there are 19-year-olds that are needed wage earners for their family, not 25-year-olds. The cutoff tends to be 25 for adults. That's because your eligibility, you age out of being financially dependent in the federal financial aid after 24. They combine work and learning at the same time or move between them frequently. They pursue knowledge, skills, and credentials that employers will recognize and compensate. Many of them require developmental education because they are first gen. If they're low income, they're coming from K-12 systems that were underperforming if they go directly or even if they don't. And most of them seek academic and career advising to navigate their complex path to a degree. What's interesting, as I was listening to Bridget's story, is that it's not that they seek it, it's that it's required. Right? They do seek it and they need it, but because their lives are complex, they need assistance. You know, one of the first papers I ever wrote when I started doing public policy writing was one called Working Learners. And I went and I read all the literature on, this is about 14 years ago. It was about middle management and how US companies were hollowing out middle management and restructuring. And above a certain level, all these folks got career counseling, they got coaching, they got support for sometimes income support, outplacement packages. And I wrote the paper based on the idea, if we think that middle managers who are well educated need all that support, how about low income college students? Do they need all that support? Probably. But just to put a face on it, The adult undergraduate student identity model that I adapted here was from Carol Casworm, she's at University of Kentucky. And this is important because they're not just a different demographic. There's an identity of the way you think about your relationship with college that's changing here. So this is my niece, actually. She's a certified nursing assistant. She's 31 years old. She spent 11 years in post-secondary education. She went to 6 colleges and universities. She has $29,000 in debt. She's repeated 5 gen ed courses. She's worked full-time 9 of those 11 years, and she still doesn't have a credential. She's now enrolled at Southern New Hampshire University online. The middle part of this triangle, I won't spend too much time on it, but folks, Carol developed this really interesting model for thinking about how do you view yourself as a learner? How do you view yourself in context of your life? Are you a parent first, a worker first? What's the extent of your relationship with knowledge? How much knowledge mastery do you have in a particular domain? And what are your set of life experiences culturally that dictate how you look at college? And I actually want to go to the next one first. From those come a learning identity that's based on your role as a worker, a community member, a family member, and a student. And engaging that learner holistically is through data, through other means, I think is the key to innovation. It's where the title of that paper came from. It's you transform higher ed by engaging these folks across all of their identities and viewing that as a learner identity. I want to skip these. So if you're trying to adapt to that holistic model, you need ways of seeing the world. This triangle is adapted from a paper that I wrote earlier. You need to have a sense of what the institutional model is. At its simplest version, it's 4-year college, 2-year R1. These are our Carnegie classifications. Are they the right ones? Which is really interesting. There's some work being done now about how to classify institutions differently by Michael Crow, actually. But what is your institutional model? Because that tells you what your value proposition is. You have to have a sense of that, and I saw that in some of the working papers that you've had. What are the technology tools at your disposal? To the extent you're not going to do all the work yourself, who are the education partner networks that you engage? Who are the folks you partner with in a sustained way? Not to build boutique examples, but what's your core value proposition, and what else can other folks do? And then the environment in higher ed like healthcare is a heavily regulated industry. What are the policy and standards environment that you exist in? Whenever I visit member campuses, I ask a set of questions around this triangle to get a feel for how they're going to be able to handle innovation. A little bit deeper, what's the model of a college? It has an institutional form and governance, and this is largely focused on the teaching and learning function. Instruction and pedagogy, it offers credential, and it needs financials to deliver against all of those. How are these connected? How do they work? When I was having a conversation this morning at the reception, and I asked, in the US, to the point relating these 2 slides, in the US, not every coordinating body like MinnState has the revenue flow through it. That has implications for how that system works. So that would go in this gray triangle right here. Model for instruction and pedagogy. So you have content and knowledge. Oftentimes this is embodied in faculty, but increasingly that's changing as well with the open education resources. There are meta skills, critical thinking, communication skills, social networks you acquire in college, and then the credentials that you receive. These are all things a college can do vertically integrated or could do in partnership with other folks. And when I add up the economic pressures and the social pressures and the student demographics, what I look at is these meta themes. When you're thinking about the soup you're swimming in, as you think about innovation, I believe that there are these transitions that are happening. We're moving from learning stocks to learning flows, from being data poor to data rich, from a system that's focused on inputs to one that's focused on outputs, to one that's less organized, to one that's more and less organized. We're moving towards a distinction between academic versus professional preparation, to a synthesis of academic and professional preparation, and from an institutional view to a system view. This is a terrific book by John Seeley Brown. It's called The Power of Pull. It's about how the economy used to be based on, if you develop new knowledge, you protected that with intellectual property. Now value is gained by sharing that. How much learning happens in an economy, the flow of that intellectual property and knowledge is actually what helps make institutions, companies, and countries successful. So knowledge flows are based on networks of people and ideas, collaboration, and refreshing your knowledge. To build on that thematic here, this graphic is from the Life Center, which is an NSF-funded research center in Los Angeles. And basically the darker green are it's a conceptual model of all the learning that you do across your life, and 16 waking hours on the vertical horizon. In grades K through 12, in grades 1 through 12, you see that 18.5% of your time is spent in formal structured learning. And it goes down, you go through undergraduate education, 7.7%, graduate education, 5.1%. The lighter green is the learning that happens in non-structured environments, in the workplace. You know, I just want to revisit the 787 Dreamliner slide. So if an associate's degree worth of learning is happening for some people outside of formally structured education, what becomes the relationship between formally structured education and the learning that's happening outside? It's a profound one. It's actually, in my writing, I've come to believe that higher education should be leading that conversation. Not telling folks what the relationship would be, but should be leading that conversation. Ideally, at least at the post-secondary level, like hospitals develop a lot of knowledge, but their core work isn't learning. It's healing people. Our core work is teaching and learning and research, expanding knowledge. We should be leading this conversation about what the new relationship is. And how do people learn? This is a seminal research project by the National Academies of Science on how people learn. And they linked up this neuroscience and what's called the expertise development literature. And essentially, the number 10,000 was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell a number of years ago in his book Outliers. And it's the expertise development research suggests that if someone does something for 10,000 hours, they become an expert or a master. It's used a lot with chess champions and athletes. But 120, of course, is the number of credits that you would get to get a bachelor's degree. And if your goal is to have a well-organized body of knowledge that supports understanding of financial concepts, that can recognize pattern in that body of knowledge, whether it's chemistry or being a doctor, what should your target be? Should it be 120 or should it be at 10,000? So is a BA a stock or is it a flow? So it's at 1 degree, 40 classes, 120 credits, or 1,600 semester hours. And how is that 1,600 connected to other learning that happens maybe outside the formal structures that get you to the 10,000? And does that happen? Does that need to happen in 4 years? The 4 to 6 year measure that we use, one of the reasons we use the 6 year is because essentially 20 years ago, the department started noticing that someone who started at 18, or the Federal Department of Education started noticing that people that started about 18 or 19 didn't finish in 4 years. And so they extended it to 6. And so that's becoming, it's a good measure for us to think about productivity, but it's also in this, if the world is changing as much as we think it is, if that learning economy is actually coming into being, if learning is becoming a flow, are we limiting ourselves by having that conversation? Maybe it should be what's the relationship between 1,600 hours and the 10,000 expertise? And how would that change an institution over time if you were wrestling with that number, not the 120? Some of the evidence that learning flows are happening are this is research by UPSEA, which is the professional okay, got it. This is the UPSEA is the professional organization for continuing education in higher ed, and they've been tracking the growth of interest in certificate level and sub-certificate level certificates. So learning that's happening in particular in professional settings, the demand for those types of credentials is growing faster. So people are either seeing a need for learning as they go through their daily work life and coming back to institutions for it, or, no, that, not or. Let me actually, so I just want to do, because I'm up on time, so I'm actually going to come back to this one. Okay. So one of my themes was it's moving from being less organized to being more and less organized. I think it's relevant here for how we think about innovation and what we do. So you have senior administrators in the board doing institutional form and governance, faculty and academic committees doing instruction and pedagogy, academic committees figuring out what are reasonable credentials and what are their requirements, and then finance, you have the cross-subsidy that happens in many institutions. You have a separation from productivity in finance. And this is changing. It's getting more organized. You're starting to have evidence-based governance. Student-level learning data is providing more focus in turning teaching is still an art, but it's making it more scientific. Credentials are becoming more transparent and they're being more connected. And financials, this is the least, in terms of designing finance for ROI, it's the least sophisticated of the two, but it's growing. We are getting more organized. The work of the University Innovation Alliance and Achieving the Dream, which focuses on community colleges. I've skipped that one. We're also getting less organized. Part of the ways that folks are dealing with the challenge is innovative partnerships. So MIT creating a micro-master's degree as a pathway into their full master's program that's low cost. AT&T forming a partnership with Udacity and Georgia Tech to deliver low-cost master's degrees. And then I want to use this one as a last example. College Unbound is a nonprofit in my home state of Providence, Rhode Island. I'm just finishing a case study on it. It serves specifically low-income, poor people from underserved populations. It went on a 10-year journey of, it was just given provisional accreditation by the regional accreditor in Rhode Island. And they're in the process of forming partnerships. Their goal is to offer a $7,000 bachelor's degree to poor people. Their bachelor's degree right now is in organizational development and change with a focus on social justice. And the reason I use this example is that College Unbound is the extreme version of what innovation can look like in an unbundled way. They do a very specific thing, and they partner with everybody else to yield a credential in that way. And so I suspect Bob Zemsky is one of my mentors. He's at University of Pennsylvania. And he suspects that we're actually going to end up seeing more diversity in higher education models in the next 25 years, not less. There's been a lot of talk of consolidation, and he believes that the institutional form is going to continue to become more varied. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Bridget. Maybe take a stretch, come up and have a seat, a little water if you like. If you have questions, comments, really do. 5-minute break. Write them up now, give them to me, give them to Lisa. Give them to me, give them to Lisa, give me a microphone. And so we recommence in 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you. Can you, there's upstairs. Anyway, terrific. Just terrific. Hey, buddy, thank you. Thank you. We'll talk about Portugal later. I sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and with 3 other guys to Portugal and fell in love with it, of course. Yeah.
I'm going to see if I can sneak some of that coffee.
Okay.
In the lobby, probably.
Will you? No, I don't. Take a look in the library. Although somebody can tell you how to get to the reception room.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's too far, probably.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
I'd love to have one too, but.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kathy, do you have anything you want to ask these guys?
Well, I will when we meet with them later.
They won't be there. Yeah. Think about it. Yeah. Let me know if you do. If we could get together again, please, and get rolling here, that'd be super. That would be just super. Luis, come on, it's time to sing for your supper. While we're doing this, I'd just like to congratulate the staff member here named Merlin, who's, I'm sure he's heard this before, is magic! Let's hear it for Merlin, he's just terrific. So are these questions, as a matter of fact. Have a seat, friends. Okay. The first one, it's a little bit long, so bear with me, but it's worth talking about. How does an innovative system or individual institution balance risk aversion with innovation? For example, low-income adult learners are clamoring for campus-based childcare options, yet many institutions are hesitant to take such on a high-risk venture and hesitate to extend already stressed support services to new realms, and I may add, take money away from the academic program, or appear to, and put it into student services. How do you navigate those two demands? Maybe start with Bridget and then go to Louis.
I think too often in higher ed, we think we have to do everything. And we have to invent a new office for that or create a new standalone support. But I feel like there are a lot of partners and communities that have, frequently people ask me, how do I serve, how do I work with universities? How do I partner with them? There are lots of folks who are bystanders who are just asking to participate and help us in local communities. So if it's about childcare, I would first do a needs analysis and an assessment of what exists in your local community and approach folks who are already doing that work and see what a partnership might look like. Too often we assume that it's going to look like a new box that we add on to the other boxes, and we're going to own that box, and that is rarely the path forward. So I would just start there in terms of, the risk aversion piece, I get it, but in the end, we're failing half of all of our students, right? We have to stop being paralyzed by the fear of acting, because by continuing to do what we're doing, we are currently failing students in a large enough number that we should free ourselves up to actually start doing some things that are, it's better than the status quo, I would argue, but.
You're saying make hard choices, can't do everything for everybody, do the most important things.
Yeah, and don't think that you have to do it as a standalone. That's a naive undertaking to
find
think
a partner,
why does a university have to start a new hospital? Why does a university have to start a new, name the thing, right?
Yeah.
We always think that that's how you see that expansion. Instead, we should leverage meaningful connections with community partners and develop really effective cross-sector relationships to solve the problems for students.
Terrific, thank you. Luis?
I would agree. College Unbound that I mentioned in my deck has a partnership with a nonprofit which is about 2 blocks away called Dorcas Place, and it's existed for 5 years. It's built into the financial model for the institution. I'll give one more example and come back to the financial model. In Chicago, one of the slides in my deck that didn't exist, the Chicago Housing Authority has created, from one of its housing units, it created a dorm for low-income students from 5 surrounding campuses and put support services at that housing authority. And it has agreements, financial arrangement with the institutions, but it also gets funding from the state to provide that particular service. And that model's existed for, I think, over a decade. So it's when you consider what your value proposition is and what your sustainable financial model is, that drives when you can find a partnership that allows you to sustain that relationship over time. Because part of what you don't want to do, and it's hard, you want to have a sense of risk enough, so know how you might rapid prototype a solution. But some testing for a pro forma for the financial aspect of it, because you don't want to keep doing that and not building those models into your sustainable financial structure. That becomes as much of a burden over time as well.
Okay, thank you. This question builds off the Innovation Alliance and ASU, but it's got broader implications than that. When 60 Minutes featured the Innovation Alliance, ASU President Michael Crow said one key to their success was to evolve from being a faculty-centered organization to a student-centered organization. The question is, what does that mean and what are its implications for innovation? Got to turn to you again since it mentions ASU, Bridget.
So just to be clear, that quote they took when they were interviewing him about ASU, and then they just cut it to say that that was the alliance. But I would say in general, it's about putting students at the center for all decision-making and strategy. And I think that faculty are an ally in that. Faculty do not want us to be having conversations solely focused on them and their needs. They are the ones who, like I said, they have a front row seat to watch the consequence of us not being strategic with our design. So that means, when do we offer classes? Lots of faculty members want to offer class at a certain time of day, but if we're really going to be serving the needs of adults or of students who are from different backgrounds, we're going to have to be more creative and also, frankly, prioritize at times the needs of students over in those cases. And I think faculty are allies in that too, because they also, they want this work to matter. They want to actually meet students where they are, or else it's not worth it, right? So I think it's not saying that faculty are harmed in this process. I would argue that they have always been the ones who have been complaining and pointing out the places where the design of the institution is failing students, and that it's often that our original design was around faculty, but I don't actually think our design works for faculty now, right? Like, you can talk about whether it's the adjunct challenges or otherwise, like in general, our design, we just haven't taken a moment to take a step out of the work to work on the work. Too much of how I see institutional behavior is we are on this hamster wheel, and it's like we have that deadline, we have that meeting, enrollment's coming, courses are starting. Like, when do we get to pause and take a step out of it and actually ask ourselves, does this make sense? And how could this be better designed? And I would argue that in the end is where we see a merging of the interests of faculty and students.
Okay. Luis, similar question. How do we shift from the sort of discipline-centric, trivium, quadrivium-centric curriculum to this student orientation business? What are some promising examples that you've encountered?
So I mean, I don't know that we need to transition. It's already here. It's here in parts of higher education, as so many things are true in higher ed. Clearly, especially in the parts of institutions that serve adults, that's normally not the focus on trying to preserve the discipline-specific thing. But I want to answer differently. For a long time, I felt that part of where we're headed, if we were institution-centric before and we're trying to be student-centric now, it's to be learning-centric. And that's what we're trying to achieve that's not actually, it's like so many things in higher ed, it's old and then it was new, then it was old again, and then it's new again. What I'm reflecting on is a gentleman named Terry O'Banion who started the League of Innovation for Community Colleges years ago. And there was a lot of work done then on the learning college. And, for learning to happen, faculty do certain things, students do certain things, administrators do certain things. Otherwise, if the lights don't go on, if the online platform doesn't work, an IT person does certain things. And one of the challenges has been we've never had really good tools for understanding if learning was happening. And we're getting better at that. And I think that's where we're headed. And so the disciplines, it allows you to do a couple of things. And then I'll use one example. I'll just use Michael's example. So Michael organized his campus to some success, I think, around grand challenges, not disciplines, right? So that's the living example. But if learning becomes the metric you're tracking, then disciplines become a part of that overall goal, not the other way around.
Very interesting. Thank you. Two questions on the rhetoric of reform, how you send the message and persuade people that it's needed. And they come from two different members in the audience, so I certainly want to honor this interest. And one expression of it is this: why does the premise always seem to me to be, quote, we are doing a terrible job, instead of there's tremendous potential? Framing him in the negatives doesn't help the cause. Luis. And let me confess, I've done that myself in making similar presentations, how bad it is, rather than how good it can be.
You know, it's interesting, like when as a policy writer, when you write about innovation, you know, oftentimes you frame innovation around challenge. And so I'm probably guilty of that myself, you know, in that way. But I also think it's like any public good or something that approximates a public good. In ACE's focus groups that we've been doing for the last year or so, you still see this dichotomy of this overall sense that higher ed somehow isn't doing what it should be doing. But then when you ask folks about the institution they know the best, they're okay with it, right? So that's always been with us on the journey. I think that part of what's changed more recently is the stakes are higher. You know, if you do happen to be one of those outliers that's above the median and you end up with $75,000 or $79,000 in debt, especially for a BA from, for example, a for-profit school that's not worth as much. Not only that, but simply the way the job market's going from my slides and Bridget's slides, the stakes are simply higher for more Americans. And I think part of the public polling data reflects that anxiety, for sure. I mean, the public polling data doesn't reflect a deep understanding of higher ed, for sure. Mm-hmm. Most folks couldn't tell you, if you asked them if ASU is a for-profit or a nonprofit, they could not tell you. The public, Pew shows that, our survey data shows that. So it's not that folks have a deep understanding of the system that they're being asked about. That doesn't mean we don't have a lot of work to do, but I think that there's a lot of noise in the public data that we need to we need to pay attention to the meta narrative, because those are the folks we have to build trust with, families, students, public policymakers, but also take it as, okay, folks, they're definitely anxious about what we're doing. Are we well enough aware of what we're doing that we can articulate it such that they understand better?
Okay, thank you.
I think people are inspired by grand challenges. I think that oftentimes as human beings, we are either trying to avoid pain or seek pleasure. And I think that in a place where people have all responded to a call, they've all been personally affected by higher education, I think that we respond best to clarity and to the big challenge about solving the challenges facing society and how we could step up. And I don't think we need more softeners. And I feel like, honestly, I collect magazines that say terrible things about higher ed. Someday it's going to make a really great slide. The whole end of college and all of that, like crazy, just like exclamation, right? It's not helpful what's going on in terms of how people talk about higher education, but it is also not really sinking in terms of within our boundaries of our institutions. Like, I hear what the public is saying. I spend a lot of time out in the Midwest. I spend a lot of time in rural areas. I hear what people are saying, and then I come into institutions and it's like, oh no, that stuff's not real, right? So I do think that having some sense of reality in terms of the urgency that is building is helpful, but I don't think of it as trying to depress us. I think it's about inspiring us to really step up and solve this grand challenge facing our country, which is, you know, how are we going to realign our work to serve the future economic competitiveness of our country? How are we going to re-engineer things? And it's not, I mean, the bone structure of higher ed is so good. What we do is so good and so transformative. I mean, my favorite day of the month is the day I pay my student loans, because it's a great reminder that it was the best investment I ever made. So you might have heard the hard part of my story, but I am just as passionate about talking about why this is really about, this is where the future is made. This is where, you know, so many families, this is how the only way they get out of the cycle of poverty, right? And so because it's so good, it's so important in society, it plays such a critical role, we cannot allow us to be putting on blinders. It matters too much. It is literally the cornerstone of how we're going to turn everything around. It is the cornerstone of democracy. And so because we care so much, and because I think people who work in this space really care, I don't think they need me to soften things or downplay them. I think that they will stand up and rise to the challenge.
Thank you. Question about technology. Luis, early in your comments, you mentioned you've done some research in technology and education and so on. Two of our former speakers, one from Morgan State and the other from Georgia State, and I'm oversimplifying a bit, so I hope they forgive me, seem to imply that you change the technology, you change behavior. And I would be interested in your take on that, and then I'd be interested in your take on it as well, Bridget.
Technology is a tool, and it changes behavior over time. In my little triangle, institutional models and mission and value proposition are at the top for that reason. Those two drive, and then oftentimes crisis drives the relationship with technology. However, technology in a business like higher ed, especially because often you're serving either waiting to serve the next generation or serving multiple generations. Once you use technology tools and you introduce them, whether it's pedagogy, student services, it does change behavior over time. One of the challenges in higher ed is if the change in behavior helps you to learn that, for example, hey, I can do this, the chatbots allow me to do student services for less money. What do you do with that savings? And whenever money moves, someone's at risk within an existing system. And I think that technology changes the behaviors and the patterns of the way people are doing the work, whether it's teaching and learning or managing student lifestyle. But then there's this other piece of it that has to do with how, as you have evidence that the tools are working, how do you use any savings and affordability to reinvest, and where do you reinvest, and does that cause challenges for how a community comes together to figure out what to do next?
Bridget, you had that wonderful slide that showed the areas of emphasis year by year and how they had a cumulative impact, which was technology and data heavy, I thought. Comment on this question when it comes to change. Importing a new technology, will it, push comes to shove, change the way people operate because they have to in order to use the technology, or is there more to it?
I think that the technology has to serve the people, and I've seen too many terrible ed tech products that are a waste of time, energy, and money, or get parachuted in from the outside and dropped like a dud and don't work. I observe behavior. I know a lot of administrators who have Hotmail accounts or Yahoo accounts, right? Like, let's actually design our work around the people and how they're actually using it. Let's not fantasize that we're all going to, transition to Workday tomorrow and it's going to be so easy, right? Like, we think technology is the answer. The formula for innovation, my observation is it's leadership plus change management, that's people, and then technology. And the modifiers for that are you have to have a visionary direction of where you want to go, and the key is repeating it 1 million times. So the kinds of institutions that innovate, you have leaders who repeat themselves. Like, you can't walk around ASU and not know that they are defined not by who they exclude, but who they include and how they succeed, right? Michael Cross begins every speech with it. That kind of repetition's key. The second, change management. You have to form teams that are actually going to have some capacity to work on any of these projects or interventions. If you just shove, again, the technology is the last piece. But if you don't have an intentional strategy around change management, and I don't mean buy-in, because that's super condescending, but actually set the table for people to have conversations about these ideas and actually help to tweak the idea and figure out and evolve the direction about the work. But the last is technology, and I would say the most important piece of technology or about any kind of ed tech product is project management and onboarding. Most companies are spending 20%, 10% of their time on that piece, and that's why a lot of the technology is not working. The companies that you're seeing things work is because they spend about 50% of their time on that part. And that's why you're seeing a consulting boom, right? The technology is not the solution. On any one of these things, people think predictive analytics, that it's the thing you buy. It's not. Most of the time, if you look at what Georgia State did, the vast majority of that is about human beings, and your technology has to serve them. And so an example of that is and I would encourage you to do this, when I go around to campuses, one of the most important questions I ask is, if I can see an academic advisor, I ask them, how many screens do you have to go through before you can diagnose a problem for a student you've never met before? They get 30-minute appointments. If they have to go through, I've heard, up to 12 screens, that is on us. The ideal is it should be a screen that gives them the information they need to make real-time decisions about advice that will actually help students. It should probably be one screen, right? That's what I mean by technology serving the work. In every case, we should be designing and choosing which technology to use based on where we are and our capacity. So that means, don't shove in a proactive advising system when you have decentralized advising and they have their own boutique way of doing it in every space. I don't know that that's going to change behavior. That's just going to be another system that several of the deans are not going to be using, right? So I just think in general, the people are our best ally. They already work here. And we just need to make it sure that the technology is not a dud and it doesn't make their lives harder. But no, the technology is not, it's not the solution.
Final question for both of you, if we can just, be succinct in responding, and then I'll invite Chair Beckett up to close this out. If you had to identify one barrier as you looked at the members of the Alliance, for example, that was serious, but also was sidestepped, overcome, modified somehow, what would that be? And I'd pose the same question to Louis.
So one barrier for
innovation, for change, for improving the results.
I think that across everywhere, I see too much of infighting, too much of this like fiefdom, president versus administrator versus staff versus faculty versus adjunct versus student. There is this kind of differentiation, and we have a lot of boundaries that we're pretty obsessed with. And I think that it gives the illusion of progress. All of the infighting makes us feel very busy and productive, but it is a massive distraction from us actually solving the problem. If I could do one thing for like magic wand, I would require that everyone in higher education who wants to work in this space has to take a course on the history of higher ed finance. Because once you understand the pressures that we are under and we open things up and we are totally transparent about where we are and what we need to do, you will see that there is no us versus them. There is one side. And the faster we could do that and actually eliminate some of this unnecessary tension or the infighting, the faster we all actually solve the problem.
Terrific. Louis?
I don't know that I have the answer. I know the answer is being lived out now. Higher education in 50 years will be a much more managed enterprise than it is now. Before World War II, we served about 1.4 million students. We now serve close to 20 million, and it'll go higher. I think it was 18 million last year. When an enterprise grows that much, it changes not just in size, but in kind. And we need to wrestle with all the issues that come from that. The historic challenges of governance versus the institution, academic versus administration. The data is taking us in that direction. The diversity of students is taking us in that direction. You can't run an institution and get the results that society seems to want today, and we should want to deliver without being more intentionally managed. And I think we're living it out now.
This is a tremendous way to wind up this set of convenings. Round of applause for our speakers, please. Come back anytime, and thanks for bringing the great weather.
All right.
Chair Beckett.